All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel on drawing maps and building worlds from a non-European perspective. Our panel today is illustrator and editor Charis Seng, writer and geologist Janna Root, and speculative fiction writers Suey Devisakumba and Jane Pinkert. Welcome, panelists. Before we start, I just wanted to quickly talk, uh, just settle ourselves in with a quick meditation on maps. Uh, Google shows us maps every day and subtly manipulates us with the kind of restaurants it shows on the maps and the ones it doesn't. We have maps that are taught to school children in India and China that lead to border conflicts. Maps mass printed in 19th century Britain that showed the British colonial territories in Africa. Those maps led to an increase in pride and just unearned sense of confidence in the colonial people. So maps could be propaganda, they could be used to manipulate, and they could be used to teach. And some of those uses of maps could also play a similar role in your own fantasy stories. The maps at the front of your book, in the simplest form, are a tool for readers to orient themselves in the world of the story, but they can also be so much more. So now, with that, I want to start, and I would first love if our panelists, if you could introduce yourselves while talking about your favorite maps from your favorite fantasy stories that showcase excellent non-European world building. And I would like to start with Jane.
All right, thanks, Sid. So I love this question. I'm Jane Pinkert, as Sid said, and I'm a writer, a researcher, and relevant to this discussion, I am a PhD dropout, and I studied pre-modern Japanese history, and my focus was maps and cartography from a historical perspective. So I'm not a cartographer, but and one of the reasons that I was attracted to that is because there are very few extant maps, actually. So I thought, oh, my scope will be really small and manageable. But anyway, so I was thinking about this question, which I think is so great. And I think for me, something really influential was and maybe this is out there, but it's the side-scrolling video game maps, where basically the map is the world that you explore. So think of like Super Mario Brothers or Castlevania, Konami 1987. And I don't know for sure that like Japanese video game makers invented this. Like I don't think they invented it, but it reminded me so much of scrolls. You know, in Japanese, like traditional books in Japan were not made like pages; they were all scrolls. So I feel like there's an interesting correspondence there, and I love this idea of a map that kind of unfolds and shows you as you go along, right? Like a scroll. So I think that was really influential for me.
Wow, that's so cool. I'd never thought about that, and I'd been playing those games as a kid too. That's awesome. Sui, what about you?
Hi, I'm Suey Devisakumba, author, a Nigerian author of fantasy, science fiction, and all of that. And I within the concept of like fantasy novels, and having like the maps on the front, I never really like paid a lot of attention to those, except of course when I was writing mine, and I was like, I have to draw a map. But I think the maps that I really think about are like those are like used in games, video games especially. One of the last I played, last two were like God of War and Horizon Zero Dawn. And I'm always thinking about, especially like part of the game is also revealing what the map says about places, and what charted and uncharted means. Sort of like I have to rethink what that means, especially within the context of the game. So Horizon Zero Dawn does this thing where you can sort of like get access to a particular object that opens an area of the map, but not just does that, also tells you where everything is versus you go charting it yourself, which means you will stumble upon stuff you're not quite supposed to stumble upon. And that really like makes me rethink what maps can do and mean, right? And how maps can actually be, as you said, wielded in various ways. I keep thinking about maps that say folks have of like the sea or something when it was like the exploration period, and they'd be like, "There's a monster here, but is it really a monster? Is it just a place they don't want people to go?" You know,
Oh wow, yeah.
questions. But yeah, I think those have like really brought up a lot of questions for me.
Well, yeah, guys, I was thinking like we'd get book maps, but now both of you are talking about video game maps, and it just makes me think about the video game maps that I like too, and that they weren't even, I wasn't even thinking about those, but now I am. That's so good. Charis, what about you?
Yeah, I'm going to quickly share my screen. So, hi, I'm Charis Seng, illustrator, comics editor, and I'm normally based in Malaysia, which is in Southeast Asia. So a lot of my work draws upon Southeast Asian influences, and I do maps for fantasy books. I also illustrate like interiors of books, do stuff for games, and one of my favorite things is to kind of do speculative fashion. So trying to combine different influences. And I think the map that I'm going to show is actually a book map. And it's actually Virginia Allen's map for the Never Tilting World by Rinchipeco. And I love this map because if you look at it, right, like it's tied in so well with the world building, because this world is a world where it's literally been split into half, and one half is in day and one half is in perpetual night. There's no sense of empirical distance in the map because the characters don't know the world themselves. Like they don't know how far everything is from where they are. So in a sense, this map is really not about geography, but it's a lot about the cosmology of the world. So how they perceive the world and what the myth and the history of the world has led it to being split down the middle. And I think as a book map, it's like super well designed because that split is also right in the gutter of the pages, which is an important consideration when we illustrate maps. So yeah.
That is so good, and like it shows like the layers that map works on world building. It's a work of art on its own, and also just as a design choice. That's really great. Janna, what about you?
So yeah, I'm Janna Root. I'm a speculative writer from Germany, living in New Zealand for now coming up to 9 years. So yeah, I've done two sides of the world. So I'm also an editor and translator, and I'm a former geologist. And I think I started loving maps when I was about 10, and we had to map our school for the first time. And I just really loved the process of mapping itself. And I have my greatest memories of sitting on some mountain ridge, trying to figure out where the different baselines of the rocks are, lined up. And as a geologist, you get so many great examples of landforms all over the world that are just purely amazing. And I think that's what inspires me most in my own fantasy worlds. And I'm just so sick of those green rolling hills as a gold standard of what a beautiful landscape is supposed to be. And one of the examples I think that does really well this non-Eurocentric mapping is you probably all know that as Earthsea from Ursula Le Guin, and that's it's all islands, and each of those islands has their own religion, or you have different religions, you have different languages, you have different cultures, and it just shows what you can do with a non-Eurocentric map. You can just much more complex world building.
Yeah, no, and I love rocks too. As not ashamed to admit, like I did a train trip from Chicago to San Francisco, passing through Utah, Arizona, all the red rocks, so pretty. Such love that landscape. Just love it. Okay, so we're going to start with non-European map making as our first topic. And to discuss that, I just want to say that European map styles are everywhere. From Mercator maps to Westeros, we're really at ease seeing the world oriented with north at the top and longitudes and latitudes and territories divided with colorful borders. we're really familiar with that stuff, but none of these design choices have to be fixed. For example, I was while researching for this panel, I saw an Indian nautical map that had a scale that was not just a distance scale, it was a time distance scale that showed how far a ship, and the unit used was zam, and one zam is how far a ship could travel over a 3-hour period. And stuff like these little touches are what can really illuminate the way people can see maps. So if we're writing stories set in non-European worlds, the map at the front of the books need not follow all of European principles of map making. So my question for the panel is, which non-European map making traditions have influenced your work, whether as an artist or a writer creating a new world? And I'd like to start with Charis.
Sure. So, I love looking at old maps from all over the world. And I was trying to figure out which one of those I would show. But then I thought about what I actually do as one of my jobs, and I realized that actually, influences how I think about maps. So you guys can see what's on the screen, right? Just checking. Yeah, so one of the things that I do a lot in my work is working with like arts and education non-profits to do what we call cultural mapping. And another term for this kind of work would be participatory mapping. So it's mapping from the ground up, where instead of the usual like single individual expert cartographer who's highly trained and goes out and maps the world, in this case, you're getting people, I work a lot with children and youth, to map their own communities. And so the kind of maps that they come up with don't look very much like fancy maps. But I love it because it shows me a whole different way of thinking about what is a map and who gets to map, and how maps are a product of the people who make them. So for kids, if they're going to map their community, they map what's interesting to them, and they might map things that adults would completely overlook. So I think just taking that kind of perspective with me into thinking about maps has been super useful. And I mean, so also then going back to a bit more conventional maps, I love the navigational charts. And if you look at the original ones, they're kind of really long and horizontal. And again, think about who's making the map and like why they're making it. In this case, the map focuses a lot on the coastlines because that's what the sailors would be really focused on. So we don't want to know what's like further inland, but we need to know the shape of the coastline, where the ships can pass. And I think what's pretty cool about this one is they also have star charts built into the map. So it's a very functional kind of map. It's not like a map that you would hang up in a palace to kind of impress people. Yeah, so 2 examples for now. I have a bunch more. I think I'll save them for the next question.
Nice. Oh wow, that's so good. And this was a surprise for me that Charis has come prepared with slides. I love it so much. Makes the panel so much more interesting. Janna, what about you?
Well, I have to admit, since I grew up in Germany, I've been very influenced by European maps, and I've just loved the whole evolution of all these blind spots and the different scales when people didn't actually know how to measure well, and so you have like really odd shapes of the land, and I just love that, especially in the fantasy map context. But I think I'm really most influenced by my training as a geologist because I tend to see the world as a whole, and so with the plate boundaries and with continents, and I think one of the first things I do in my world building is to really figure out where my country or my city or where my plot is happening, where it is situated as a kind of latitude things. Because when you look at fantasy maps, you will notice, as you said, they are all oriented to the north, but they're not just oriented to the north, they're all northern hemisphere. You always have snowy mountains in the north and deserts in the south. And well, living in New Zealand kind of opened up like, what about a fantasy world? I mean, we have like a fantasy world everywhere. Like, why not put it on the southern hemisphere? So yeah, that's how I approach maps nowadays. It's trying to change the things around.
You know, like until you said that, I didn't even notice that. Like, if so many maps, even like, if you go back to Westeros, like it's just the northern hemisphere, and it just cuts off at the bottom. And almost all fantasy maps you can think of in the epic fantasy realm are kind of like that. So interesting. Sui?
Yeah, this has been also great to listen to because I would say I'm completely a mess at maps. And I guess one of the things I really thought about when it was time to think about making the map for Son of the Storm, which is my new novel, was that I had to really think about how distance was thought about in this world. And often a lot of the maps would like frame, distance and scale and stuff like that. But I was thinking about more informal ways that people think about distance, right? A 3-day walk, how do you put that on a map, right? Uh, cardinal directions, cardinal, right? Using that word. Directions, right? Would be maybe based on where the sun sets and where the sun rises. So I guess I thought about what the map would look like, and I thought it would probably be very spare because no one's gonna write that. And another thing that I've been thinking about after, post drawing that map was how maps we always forget about like the notes that come with maps and expect that maybe the map tells the whole story. But like I think maps, especially at the time that I was drawing from, which is like 15th century West African empires, it will probably have been a lot of drawings and like signals, and then those signals explained in detail and said, oh well, when we drew this arrow, we meant that when you walk by crow's eye for like 3 days, you find this rock or whatever, and then you have to like circumvent it. It'd be more convoluted in that way.
Yeah.
And I also come from a country where there's not a lot of road signs. So pretty much if you want to go anywhere, if you want to risk it with Google Maps, good luck. But if you don't want to do that and you want to ask someone how to get there, it will be almost virtually impossible for them to draw you a map. That's just impossible. So what would likely happen is they would say, all right, this is how you get there. And then they tell you a story. And the story is pretty much, what I've just said. You walk straight, make sure you keep looking on your left for to sight this, like to like see this thing. And then when you get there, you do this, you do that. So it's more of like directions. And so yeah, I thought a lot about directions and how I didn't really want to make the map itself do so much heavy lifting, and I was thinking about, especially because I didn't do that for this book, but I'm already thinking about it like for the next 2 books, like how can I get those map notes into the idea, right? How can I get that idea into the actual map making, even if it's words and not drawings, but of map making, because that's what it's supposed to be about. It's about direction. And, well, it depends on the purpose of the map, but yeah, that's one of the purposes at least.
Yeah, no, and like as you were describing that map, I was remembering the map from the Traitor Barrow Cormorant. Like it's basically it's an in-world map, but she's drawn it herself, and she's drawn it with like all the notes, like okay, this duchy does this. This is how the trade winds move. This is what this town is doing, and then questions for herself. I love that stuff, and it's a tool, and it makes you more interested in the world too. Jane, what about you?
Yeah, what Suey said was so interesting because it made me think that the way humans experience space is exactly what you said, right? We say you go down the street and you pass neighbor so-and-so's house and then you take a left. And a map is such an abstraction of that, which I think is so interesting. I also am really drawn to city maps and urban planning because I love these sort of visionary projects of we're going to make the perfect city, which is a thing that ancient Japan did a lot. They never succeeded, obviously, but right. But they would found a capital and they'd be like, it is going to be like this. It will have straight lines and be beautiful and everything will be proportional, which they all borrowed from, ancient Chinese urban planning ideals. But I love how the reality of the lived city is so at odds with this perfect ordered vision. And that's what I love exploring in fiction as well. And right now I'm working on a map for an RPG project, for a role-playing game project. And I really want to try to convey that the perfect map idea is completely different from how the players are actually going to experience these spaces, I hope, because I think that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I just love like how the maps could be you like thought of as like, please do this, and this is how it should be. Whereas the people are like, no, we're not gonna do that. All right, let's go on to our next topic. This is about maps and colonization. So maps have all rarely been used just as tools for getting from place to place. Cartographers worked with monarchs and they cut up the world into claims for their masters, often places that they hadn't ever been to themselves. European cartographers often worked off information from European surveying teams that mapped African and Asian territories without any input from the indigenous people of those lands. So, as we move away from seeing the world through only Eurocentric views, we have to start we have to stop thinking, seeing those worlds through European eyes, where interests that European commercial firms had, like resources, rivers, harbors, and borders. So my question to the panel is, what can we learn when we begin to look at maps from a non-Eurocentric view? And what can we see that gets overlooked in the standard Eurocentric map? And I'd like to start with Suey.
Okay, thanks. One of the things I've learned, I guess, is that maps are a political document, almost often a political document, wherein they say something about the person who has made them, what they choose to indicate on the maps, right? What they choose to favor, what they choose to, make bigger. So one useful example is a lot of the maps. This is very surprising. I was also surprised to learn this, but like a lot of maps that are used in education today are actually maps that were specifically created to make the continents in the global south appear smaller than those in the global north, specifically. And there are alternative maps, but they're like not as common, where you see the proper sizes of the continents. But like one of the ways I learned to do that was to like zoom out on say Google Maps, right? And actually measure, like compare the sizes and compare them to like a regular map you'd see on the like on the wall. And often like the continent of Africa would be like many sizes smaller than it's supposed to be and stuff like that. And that's one example. And like when I think about maps for my world as well, I've also been thinking about that. One of the events that's taking place currently in book 2 of my series that I'm writing is that there's this scholar from like this world who's supposed to know and understand everything, and then so there's like a plan that's being made, and someone pulls out a map, and he's like, "What is that?" And they're like, "Oh, this is a map of everywhere." And he's like, "That is not correct. That's the wrong map. Who drew that?" And they were like, "Oh, I see. Oh, you mean you've only seen this map?" And then they show him the map that he's used to, that he's learned with, and he realizes that that map is pretty much everything he has ever known and understood about the world. But it's not just. It no longer just becomes like this drawing of land masses and directions. It becomes a statement about who the other people who aren't represented, of how people are represented, how you choose to see and understand people. Maps are like one of the first tools that can be used to proliferate certain ideas. And so, yeah, that's pretty much what was done for most of the colonization periods. And one of the paths to decolonization even is to like rethink how, if like the representations, even the understanding of who that we have of ourselves is correct. A lot of the cartography and like studies in geography that are being done in like Nigeria now are trying to like decolonize themselves, to stop studying Nigeria through the same lenses and try to like rethink what are the values we have in land, right? In natural resources, because all of these are the maps are still what kind of like direct us and tell us, if we, tourist spots are like good examples, like what spots are like the best for like bettering tourism, but like our maps are telling us something different. So do we have to redraw the maps and like get, so it's a lot of thinking that goes into it. Yeah, that's just one of my experiences.
Wow, yeah, no, that's the thing. Like even growing up in India, like we saw a series of maps of India, and I distinctly remember like we're still learning where all the natural resources are, and then the map of all the train systems, and but not the context of why we're learning about any of that stuff. Oh, wow. Charis, what about you?
I think lately I've been kind of looking into what we would or more like indigenous traditions of map making. I think Jane is probably gonna talk about this as well, but the idea of like that counter mapping and critical cartography. So these are examples of like maps made by the Zuni people. I think they live now in New Mexico. So for them, when they think about the landscape, like landscapes are associated with memories, with stories. How do you create a visual that incorporates those stories or the memories or the emotions that you would associate with a place? So in terms of just very simply looking at the visuals here, we don't have that kind of God's eye view from the top that's often associated with maps of empire, because those maps are meant to show, this is my territory, this is how I parcel it out. But if you're making a map about how you see a place, maybe you want to have stuff from a different perspective. You put in things that are important to you. Another thing that people are doing quite a lot now in anthropology and sociology is thinking about non-humans. So if you guys go to this website, it's great. Like it's a completely different way to think about how to organize, like maps and like. So I'm not gonna spoil it for you, but you can explore this website and just it kind of does away with what you would think about normal ways of organizing maps or like organizing information flow. I think the last example I'm going to go through is something I've done for a book that's also very about colonization. So this is Kason Calendar's Queen of the Conquered and King of the Rising, which is basically about, this islands have been taken over by colonizers, and to the extent that the people don't actually remember their history. So for me, when I read the manuscript, I was trying to figure out, how can I tell the story through the map in a way that kind of reflects how the plot is set up. So I decided I would try to do it through the margins of the map, because people normally don't look at what's on the borders. Like you think borders are decorative, but in this case, the margins really kind of tell the story. So the coins are a coinage for each of the islands, because different colonizing families have taken over and they're so rich that they can mint their own money. If you look at there's like woven grass bands, and some of the grass bands are kind of fractured, and a lot of it hints at what happens in the plot. So mirroring what happens in the plot, if you weren't paying attention to the margins, you can also miss up the plot elements. And I've very consciously not included any kind of compass rose or latitude or longitude lines, and that kind of burnt hole in the corner where normally you would have like a nice little title or something is also burnt out. Maybe the slaves have burnt it out because they've taken over this map and kind of appropriated it for their own use. So I think even within the kind of constraints of like a fantasy book map, there's a lot that we can kind of do to subvert tropes.
Wow. Somebody in the Discord said that they want to rewatch this panel, and I wanted to reply, I want to rewatch this panel and just stare at all of Charis's art. Wow, that is so cool. I'm pretty speechless. Janna, what about you?
Yeah, those maps are gorgeous, Charis.
That is
Amazing.
gorgeous.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I just when we think about colonialism, but when we look at maps, the first thing we see are boundaries. Like in traditional maps, we see like every time you get in school and you learn about the world, you see boundaries, and those boundaries. I mean, if you look at Europe, those boundaries shifted a lot, and they've usually been on landforms and so. But then if you go to those parts of the world that have been colonized, you see these super straight boundaries that have absolutely no regard for what the country is really like, what the people living there like. I mean, there are people that have been split. Basically, they're living in 3 different countries, even though they are like one group. And I think, yeah, that's how the map is actually covering up what's actually happening in the world. And one of the things that is really weird when we look at it is that we have this absolute need to claim every piece of land. Like, for example, the Sahara. I mean, I know there are people that are traversing the Sahara, but they're not going to stop at the Mali border and turn around or anything. There's like, but still there has to be a border in there. Or a very extreme example is Antarctica. There's nobody living in Antarctica, and I know it's special because it's not really governed, but it's more like a research thing. But still, there are 7 countries that have a territorial claim to Antarctica, to a country where nobody lives, and still there can't be any single space that is unclaimed, and that's just so weird.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, before you said that, I didn't even think about that we can leave unclaimed space on a map. And it reminds me of the Western Sahara and the conflict with Morocco, where Morocco is trying to claim that also. And just there's no spot, even if there are no people there, that humans would just leave there. Jane, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the insidious things about maps as political documents, like Suey said, is that they're often read by many people as if they're natural somehow, like, right? And that's the power of the map, to present this information as immutable, like it's always been this way. Japan has always existed here. This is our territory. And it kind of naturalizes and reifies these constructed, totally made up boundaries, like Janna was saying. So I think that's really powerful. The second kind of big powerful thing about maps is I think there's been this very, and Europe is not the only civilization that's guilty of this, certainly, but the drive to map, like Janna was saying, like this drive to claim and map and to know, and it's all done under the guise of like, exploration and science, and we're just trying to find out what happened, but if you get in our way, we're gonna kill you. And so it's produced this this justification for so much incursion, like colonial incursions, in the service of this idea of like, we must map out the entire world. So I think that's also really interesting. And I think a lot about how do we decolonize that. I think a lot about what Charis was talking about, counter mapping, and how would people who don't have access to classic cartographic tools, how would they build maps? What would be the maps that would be important to them? Show a child like a map to get to grandma's house, for example, or something. Right, or a list of directions. So I think a lot about that too. Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's just more like I thought about this topic at first. I was like, okay, this is just maps. Everybody knows maps. It's pretty easy. And then no, there's just so many layers and layers and layers to how, all the decisions that go into making a map. And what you're saying about maps being used as justification, that's what was happening in Asia and Africa too. We're like, let's go here. Let's see. I just want to know what's happening over there. I just want to see where the Nile leads to. That's all. I just want to see where it came
For
from.
science.
For science. Yeah. The next topic I want to talk about is geography now. So it's moving away from maps a little bit and starting to talk about craft. So as writers, the world building scope of a story is limited to the geographies that we've selected for that story. If we close our eyes and we think of a normal epic fantasy map, it's going to have, as Yana said, rolling green hills and those tall gray mountains and dark green forests. And you're going to lead to a certain set of choices for that map: landed knights, serfs, castles. But if we have a map like Earthsea and you have an archipelago of islands, you have a different set of social structures that can come from a different sets of conflicts. So my question for the panel is, can you give a few examples from either your work or your favorite works of the range of world building choices and conflicts that become available when you write outside of European geographies? And I'd love to start with Yana.
So I'll just say we have such a beautiful world with so many beautiful landforms, and there's so much you can do. It's just you don't even have to make it up. You can just look at our world. And I've already talked about the North and Southern Hemisphere thing. Another thing I want to talk about is seasonal climate versus daily climate. So when we have our standard fantasy worlds, we have a very seasonal climate. So we have spring, summer, autumn, winter, often preparing for winter. But I mean, you can go north or south, depending on where you are in the hemisphere, and you have like these half-year winter, half-year summer things. You can go more closer to the equator, and you will get less seasons. You will have, even here in New Zealand, we do have a seasonal climate, but we have flowers flowering all year long, and there's not such a big explosion of plant life in spring. You can go to the tropics and you won't have any seasonal climate. So people there, they won't prepare for a long winter in terms of food. So you have different conflicts. You have conflicts about a daily climate with a rainfall that happens every day. And another thing that's very dear to my heart, because I was an earthquake geologist, is natural disasters. And in Europe, or at least in Central Europe, we are very privileged in terms that there aren't many natural disasters. Like there might be the occasional flood, an occasional storm, but there are no earthquakes and there are no volcanoes. And you can see that, for example, in Lord of the Rings. Where do we have we have one volcano? Like we have a single, totally unrelated to plate boundary action or something. We just have a single volcano in the middle of nowhere, probably a hotspot or anything. And but when you look at the reality of our world, we have so many people living in areas that are constantly subjected to earthquakes. To you have Bangladesh constantly being with floods. You have Japan; they change their building codes. Like the buildings are different because they have frequent earthquakes. You have the entire Pacific Ring of Fire, and you have Mexico City built on a volcano. So so many people around the world are living with natural disasters, and I would just love that to be more of a factor in fantasy stories, because that's more the reality of more people actually. And I've been trying. Unfortunately, I can't tell you to buy this book because it's still being edited and stuff. It's not being published yet. But yeah, it's something that I try to do in my books, is to include more natural disasters, not just as a plot device, but as a thing that influenced life in my fantasy world. So
that is so key, especially as we start including climate change more in our stories, to show natural disasters as forces that affect the plot. And if you set your story in geographies like Bangladesh or volcanic Mexico City, you'll have different types of disasters to draw from. So good stuff. Jane, what about you?
Yeah, I think that is such a great point. How do you build a map that depicts an ever-changing world? I guess is my sort of bigger question, and that would be a really cool thing to think about. I think a lot about how, so in Japan, the prevalent faith or belief system is Shinto, which believes that it's animistic. So the rock has a spirit, the mountain has a spirit, the tree has a spirit, and so there's sacred sites, basically, like literally all over Japan. And I think a lot about how do we, how could a fantasy map depict these in a new, obviously these sites are really important to people, and they might be important in different layered ways. Like, we go to this tree in the summertime to do this thing, but we go to this rock in the winter to do this thing and ask for this. And I just thought it would be so cool if you could build some kind of visual imagery that could indicate that, so that, you know, it's like, it's not just a map of the space, but it's a map of our activities in that space and the times at which we do those activities. Charis, this is a challenge for you to do, because I cannot do it, but I want someone to. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, no, this is the amount of stuff you can just think about, just starting with the map itself, and just as writers, if we just start with our map, if we're just world building, and you can create all sorts of conflicts if you just layer in another layer of just activities, what we do with the space, and not just as a blank canvas of landscape. Suey, what about you?
Yeah, I think in fact for like the last, you know, for this my current work, the literal conflict comes out of maps, right? It's the world is divided into like two very major areas, one of which is majorly desert and one of which is majorly like rainforest and has more greenery. And there's just like a small strip of land that connects them. And of course, the more powerful force, or you know, sort of like blocks there immediately and like you know, puts a border that doesn't actually exist and places a border and says, all right, anyone who wants to cross over to come to the good place needs to, you know, pay this whatever, and forget that the fact that it's one continent, but just because that there's that you know, space that they can sort of close up, it becomes, this is our side of the continent and this is your side of the continent, and that's just like the start of everything. And there's many other things. I liked what we're saying earlier about like buildings and how building codes change. There's a part of the world as well where, you know, folks live on the coast, so they don't build doors because it doesn't even make sense. The coast like erodes like every other day, and so they have to move the house inland and build it again or rebuild it. And so people just stop building doors and windows. They just build like the shelter and like leave it at that. So things like that are things I also think about while map making.
Nice. No, just I guess, yeah, not just your story conflict, but just small cultural details like that, like will be influenced by your geography, whether your house is built on stilts, whether it has doors and things like that. Charis, what about you?
I think I'll just do it really quickly for this question because I know we still have stuff after this. Well, for me, a lot of the time, you know, the maps I make are obviously going to be influenced by what the writers have planned. So I can't go about designing like an entirely different world. Normally, we get sketches from the writer, like rough ones, and then I turn those into maps. So in that sense, you know, the geography is kind of half figured out. Like I do have to fill in some parts. But where I start thinking a bit more is, you know, obviously with the geology and geography, you have the resources that the people living there would have. So if those people were the ones making the maps, like how would their maps look like? So what if they were living in a place where they preferred to make maps on, I don't know, animal skin compared to paper, compared to stone, compared to, you know, if you're in a sci-fi world, maybe it's a completely different kind of laser hologram map. I don't know. So yeah, that material consideration is what I would be thinking about.
And so like for the map for the Bone Shard daughter, did that come from that kind of consideration where the art style is what people of that world would have used?
Yeah, I mean, I guess since you've asked it, I'll just like jump right into that and talk about that now.
I want to see that map.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting there. Very soon. So yeah, I mean, I guess the way I like to think about maps is think about maps as artifacts coming from the cultures that made them. Because you know, now I'm doing this like social science kind of degree. So for me, like a map is kind of the result of all the different human activity and choices that have arrived at that point. So things from like technology, like what kind of writing technology, painting materials did they have, all the way down to like history of the world. So yeah, we can think about, how does the culture of the people come across in the map? Like, it can be very simple things like the aesthetic style. I mean, this one is obviously based on, Chinese ink painting, but things like labels. If you have a bunch of like royal families, maybe they each have their own seal. And obviously someone has commissioned this map and these guys have like stamped their seals all over the map. That's kind of some of the world bleeding in. If you have a world that's kind of set in this strange, vague future where there's like tech, but it's also kind of magic-y, like how can you get that across in the map? And so for this, I was like, what if the map is like this object that a character could be carrying around and they don't understand like all this tech that they're using that comes from the past? So, the Cs could be like circuit boards,
Mhm.
because circuit board lines remind me of waves and like, why not? Things like that. And yeah, so for the Bone Shard Daughter map, I mean, this was interesting because the world itself, so what I understand from reading, and I read the entire manuscript for like every single book. So the islands like move with the seasons, which means that the currents and the seas are actually quite important. And so it would be kind of weird to try to nail down like exact distances between them because they're going to move anyway. So in this case, it would mean that the waves and the sea should kind of be like a key part of the map. So I tried to play that up by really highlighting it in the way it's drawn. Things like typography, like I hand letter all of these because I can't find any fonts that work. And so even the way that it's hand lettered takes after like Chinese calligraphy. The borders, so we assume that this is a map that the imperial palace might use, and the chrysanthemum motif is quite a big thing in the book, so we can put that in the border as well. Same thing about seals here. And this one has a compass rose because it was requested for. But even then, I tried to kind of
no.
customize it a bit so that, it looks like it comes from that world and it has the animals from that world
Okay.
in it.
Wow. This is so good. There's a Charis fan club happening in the Discord right now. We only have 2 minutes left. I'm so sad we won't be getting to the last question. If everyone is okay, I could post our answers to the Discord so that people could have them. But since we only have a couple of minutes left, I just wanted to give some space for everybody to talk about any upcoming projects that they would like to share. So I'm gonna start with Jane. Do you have anything coming up or anything out already?
Yeah, well, I have a bunch of stories out, and I'm working on launching a new community space called Story Kitchen, where the idea is that we think of techniques of fiction as ingredients that we mix rather than like recipes we have to follow. So I'll be launching that this summer.
Awesome. Suey?
Nothing new apart from the Son of the Storm, which is my new novel that also has this cover art. It's coming out on May 11th from Orbit, first in the trilogy called The Nameless Republic. So look for it, find it anywhere.
Awesome. Charis?
Well, I actually don't have a lot of stuff coming up because this year I've been focusing on like finishing my master's. So I'm working on my thesis, which is also about mapping, but getting artists to map their own networks, which is its own thing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Janna, what about you?
Well, I'm currently working on an urban fantasy series called Spirit Seekers, which I hope to be publishing around August, September. And that features very heavily natural disasters.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to all of that stuff. Thank you so much. We are out of time now. I don't know what happens next.
Thanks, everybody. I think you just end the meeting if you want, Sid.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and
everybody.
those of us who have time, we can hop onto the Discord and like keep chatting there.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll be there.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.